This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is crime and forgiveness. I have two people who've written extensively on the subject, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is crime and forgiveness, and I have Erin Kelly and Robert Enright. They will be talking about that. I like to give all of my guests a little chance to define themselves, give a little background about who they are, what they've written, or what they've done in regards to the subject. So let me start with you, Erin, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself and your interest in the subject matter.
Sure. I am a professor at Tufts University of Philosophy, and my research has been focused on issues of social justice for many years. I'm also interested in questions about responsibility, and my interest in social justice and ideas about responsibility led me to thinking about criminal justice quite some years ago, to think about how we think about responsibility within the criminal justice system and how we reckon with the injustices of our society in connection with how we think about crime. So I wrote a book called The Limits of Blame, Rethinking Punishment and Responsibility that was critical of retributive ideas about punishment. Retribution is the idea that somebody who's done something wrong deserves to suffer, ethically speaking. So that's been a longstanding interest of mine. And more recently, on kind of a different note altogether, I wrote a book with artist Winfried Rembert to tell the story of his life. He's a remarkable person and artist, African-American man, born in 1945 in Georgia. And so the book, which is a memoir about his life, talks about his experience in the Jim Crow South, his experience in the criminal justice system. After getting involved in the civil rights movement, he ended up incarcerated in Georgia and put on chain gangs for 7 years. And later in life became an artist and wanted to tell his story both through his artwork and in his words. So I helped him tell the story, which is relevant to our subject today, because for me, the whole project was an exercise in listening and empathy and thinking from a different perspective than my own, which is all relevant to forgiveness. Not that I needed to forgive Rembrandt for anything, and that wasn't the subject of the memoir, but it was an interesting project that I think is relevant to thinking about ethical issues, about truth and reconciliation when it comes to problems of wrongdoing and injustice.
Yes, and we'll definitely get into minority, how minorities in a system are handled, whether they're ethnic, racial, whatever, or sexual. Robert Enright is my other guest. Robert, if you could give a little background about yourself and your takes, what you've written about forgiveness.
Sure. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Educational Psychology, and I hold the Aristotelian Professorship in Forgiveness Science there. I'm also a licensed psychologist, and I'm a founding board member of the International Forgiveness Institute. And I had the honor with graduate students at the University of Wisconsin to be the first to publish empirical or scientific research in journal articles on the topic of forgiveness. And we've done a lot of interventions, for example, people in drug rehab. And one of our most recent ones is with men in a maximum security correctional facility, where we actually help them to forgive. And I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about that today and what that really means for corrections and what that means for individuals who are behind bars.
Well, let me start with you, Robert, since I want to sort of start from the beginning. About 50 or 60 shows ago, I did a couple of shows with a couple of fellows regarding what's called the deep roots theory of war with mankind, and the idea that some people have that all human beings are necessarily violent, selfish, self-aggrandizing, these sorts of things, which then leads to acts of violence. In your studies, since you talk about a scientific take on forgiveness, how far back do you go? Do you go back to Cro-Magnon man? Do we go back to the first people that built clubs, and we have the rock tribe and the river tribe, and they're beating each other, and then one caveman said, I'm not going to hit this guy, and just walked away? where does forgiveness come from, and how does it fit into the sort of evolutionary psychology of humans?
Well, if you take a look at the printed record, I'm an egghead academic, so I try to read everything, at least in English, that I can read. And I think, from what I can tell in terms of the printed word, the first exposition on forgiveness was actually in the Hebrew culture with their first book of scripture, which is in Genesis, chapters 37 to 45. That's a lot of chapters, in which Joseph forgave his 10 half-brothers for attempted murder, throwing him down a pit, throwing him into slavery in Egypt. And they came to him when he was now in a position of power in Egypt, and he wasn't too happy with them. He first threw them into prison, so he wasn't all forgiving. But when he heard them lamenting, he wept. And then he asked that his full brother Benjamin come down to Egypt, and he kept one of his half-brothers back just to be sure. When he saw Benjamin, he wept a second time. And then when he gave them lots of provisions and played a trick on them, and one of them said, well, don't arrest all of us, just take me instead, he wept a third time. And 3 is a symbol in Hebrew scripture of perfection. And he embraced them unconditionally, with no more throwing into jail and no more tricks. He revealed himself as Joseph. They didn't know he was. They thought he was a slave there. And actually, his forgiveness in that historical record was responsible for basically saving the Hebrew nation. Because without his generosity and his unconditional outpouring of goodness to those who totally weren't good to him, the Hebrew nation might not have survived. And so when you look at that as the first exposition, chapters 37 to 45, and if you look at the Hebrew writings, it's very parsimonious. You don't see a lot. They get to the point and get out. But this was a lot of chapters. It shows the profound importance given to forgiveness in a person-to-person way, with the effects of getting a family back and, in fact, saving a nation.
Do you have any comments, Erin? Any that might be a bit more secular than the sort of religious tradition?
I do agree that, at least in my understanding, the philosophy of forgiveness was rooted in Christian thought. But in our day, in the philosophical world, there's been quite a bit of interest on the part of philosophers in thinking about forgiveness in secular terms and trying to define and understand its logic without presupposing religious faith. But I do think that that the structure of thinking about forgiveness and the concept bears a strong resonance with the role of that concept in Christian thought.
So let's then move up and we'll talk a bit more philosophically about crime and forgiveness. So usually we talk about prisons, and we speak of the penal system or the judicial system or the justice system. Rarely do we, in this day, even though technically a lot of criminals are supposed to be rehabilitated, when we go back to the earliest penal systems, we go back to, say, Britain, or even back to classical Greece, or if you know anything about China or anything, is forgiveness something that begins within any sense of justice systems in the earliest societies, or is that something that's a later invention after the Magna Carta or something? Let me start with you, Erin.
I'm not familiar with forgiveness as something emerging from penal systems. Maybe Robert can speak to that. My understanding of the history of punishment systems is that they have not been forgiving, and they continue not to be forgiving. So I wouldn't look to criminal justice systems for the origin or logic of forgiveness.
I would agree 100% with that. I have actually never seen anything way back that even had a glimmer of hope of forgiveness, either the seeking of forgiveness by those who've committed the crime, or the forgiving by those who've been victimized, or what we're doing nowadays, shining the light of forgiving on those who are imprisoned. It is actually just a complete silence, which I actually find fascinating, because there's plenty to do now in changing thinking on this, and it's about crime.
Well, what are some of the ways that things are being changed? Because I know when I Googled the subject to look for people to talk about it, probably the first 2 pages of Google regarding crime and forgiveness are about in-prison facilities that have programs, either they're national programs that have little sort of, I guess you'd call them chain outlets within certain prisons, or they're usually run by ministries of some sort. Did forgiveness arise in, say, the modern sense of the penal system as outcroppings of religion in the way, say, the abolitionist movement did? Either one of you.
Erin, why don't you go first on that one?
The programs that I'm familiar with that involve some exercise of forgiveness in prisons are typically connected with the idea of restorative justice, which is part of a movement that has been initiated by people who are very unhappy with the way in which the criminal justice system has attempted to achieve accountability, and have been very critical of the era of mass incarceration that we're in, the overly punitive approach that the state has taken to criminal wrongdoing. So restorative justice has, which for some people involves the concept of forgiveness, but not for everyone, is an alternative model of accountability that has made some inroads into the criminal justice system as an alternative to criminal punishment, or as something that might be associated with a diminishment of criminal punishment, in order to provide a forum for people to engage in a dialogue about crime and the harm that it's done, in order to try to repair it to the extent possible. So it's an alternative program, and it has attracted interest on the part of some inmates in prisons, as well as victims and members of communities outside of prisons who are interested in ways of thinking about how to respond to and resolve problems connected with crime and the hurt that it's done, without turning to the punishment system as the solution.
Robert?
We have to keep in mind that this idea of forgiveness being embedded even in restorative justice can be wildly controversial. Let me just give you an example. If I were to address a restorative justice group and suggest that victims think about forgiving the perpetrator for the victim's own good, here likely would be a response. How dare you say that? Victims already have been victimized. You're now asking something of them that's very hard to do, and quite frankly, very inappropriate. Because what you're doing, Enright, is you're asking everyone to wipe the slate clean and forget about the cost and what is owed to that victim. And what you're really doing is moving toward excusing the perpetrator's behavior, condoning the behavior, not as unjust, and giving the perpetrator an out by saying 3 little words: I am sorry. And so forget about forgiveness. But see, from a philosophical viewpoint, those who say that are deeply misunderstanding what forgiveness is. They're equating forgiveness with excusing and condoning and wiping the slate clean and moving on, rather than it being a self-chosen moral virtue when a person is ready to be good to those who are not good to the victim. And I hold the Aristotelian professorship, and Aristotle taught me this: not throwing away the other moral virtues when you forgive. What oftentimes happens in the restorative justice model when people disparage forgiveness is they think in what I would call either or ways. You either forgive or you seek justice, but you don't do both. That would not be classical philosophical thinking from ancient Greece. Forgive and seek justice. Forgive and not wipe the slate clean. The biggest problem I see with regard to forgiveness in a correctional context is woefully misunderstanding what the concept even is.
Well, isn't that a political thing in this country? I mean, we have the three strikes, we have the war on drugs, where we're putting away people, not for even violent crimes. I mean, talking about the Ted Bundys or the terrorists, people who just wantonly disregard life. When you lock up a lot of people because they prefer this drug or that drug, they've grown up with an alcoholic father or mother who left or something. The whole idea of forgiveness is to take in more than just the crime, isn't it? Or the trespass, if we want to use, if someone trespasses against you in some way, for the forgiver, the potential forgiver, to take in more than just themselves and how they were hurt. Is that not so?
Bingo, 100%, Dan, yes. What has happened, as I understand it, in the system of punishment for crime is there has been what we would call reductionism. There has been a focus only on the crime itself and you pay the penalty, and that's it. Well, how's that been going for recidivism rates, for people going back into crime once they've been released from prison? Not so well. We call them correctional facilities. How much correction is going on? Well, maybe we need more than putting them behind bars, locking the door and forgetting about who they are as persons. As you're saying, we have to broaden our view of who these people are, what they have faced in their life, rather than defining them exclusively by the crime, okay? When I go into prisons, for example, and I talk to, it's usually men, they have name tags and I have a name tag. And on their name tag, it always says inmate. And so I usually stop and say, I don't like your name tag. And what don't you like about it? They say, they're defining you by your address. You are more than an inmate. You know what? Their eyes open up. Something opens up for conversation. I'm more than an inmate? Really? Because even they start believing the lie that that's all they are, and that's not helpful.
Aaron, I want to ask you, I mentioned three strikes and the drug war. To what degree has politicization of the criminal justice system been deleterious to not only the idea of forgiveness, but even just sort of basic rehabilitation, the correctional facility, the correction of the person, as Robert said?
I think the exploitation of crime as a political issue is something that politicians have used to gain public support, at least the support of some of the public, in order to score some points against their opponents in a way that's not very forward-thinking or very sensitive to the impact of this tremendous investment in incarceration on American democracy. Democracy in scare quotes. I'd like to see us move in a more genuinely democratic direction, but I think that attitudes toward crime and punishment have been very destructive for the prospects of democracy. So yes, I think the politics of crime have exacerbated the problem of hyper punishment and punitiveness in American society in ways that are not to the public good and are not in line with a healthy concept of justice, of democratic justice. And going back to what Robert was saying earlier, I agree that we should get out of the mode of thinking that justice and forgiveness or alternatives to punishment, if we're going to take a broader category, are opposed to one another. But that means shifting our thinking about justice so we have an understanding of justice that's compatible with alternatives to punishment and with the kind of thinking that leads some people to forgive and to benefit from the practice of forgiveness. So I agree with him, but let's think about justice in a broader, more democratic, sort of more forward-thinking way. We
Yeah.
need to move away from a retributive model of justice. I think that's been hanging us up.
Robert, you look like you're ready to go.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. Retribution, in my opinion, if it's only exclusively retribution, you know what that does? It makes those who are behind bars even angrier. And what it does is it increases the rage rather than beating it out of them. And so my thought is, as a psychologist studying forgiveness, we have to begin looking at the whole person who is behind bars. And we have to see that person as more than an inmate, more than someone who's committed this crime, and ask ourselves a very controversial question, which is this. Without excusing the person, I want to ask the question, what has happened in this person's life to induce such a rage that this person now is going to perpetrate mayhem on others? I tend to work in the maximum security context, and we don't ask that question. Right? Here's just an example of what I mean about seeing the whole person. I talked with a group of men, and they were all, for the most part, what we call mass murderers, okay? And one gentleman was in for life because he killed his whole family. And in this group, we asked, what has happened to you to break your heart? And one guy started crying, okay? And this was the guy who shot his whole family, okay? And the counselors were taken aback by this because they'd never seen this in him. And they said, why are you crying? And he said, nobody has ever asked me this before. So they said, well, what's your story? And he said, when I was an adolescent, whenever I would misbehave, my father, for my punishment, would make me crawl on my hands and knees on a pebble-stoned driveway all the way down. It was a long driveway to get the mail, then crawl back again on my hands and knees and hand the mail to my father. He asked me to do this and demanded this of me over and over and over again until I was 16, old enough to pick up his hunting rifle. And in my rage, I shot and killed the whole family. Right? No one ever knew that. I am not saying he should have killed his family. I don't want to be misunderstood, but here's what I am saying. What if this young man at 16 had learned how to forgive his father for this abuse? This was child abuse. And what if the father, who probably has a story somewhat similar to this of abuse when he was a child, could have forgiven those who abused him? Do you think he would have picked up the rifle and shot the whole family? I say no. I think the whole family would be alive today if we had only asked the question, what broke your heart? And we never ask that, and that frustrates me.
So let me ask both of you, because a lot of people just watching now the first 20 minutes or so that we've talked would say, oh, God, these bleeding heart liberals, they just, and they'll bring up, the 9/11 terrorists. They'll bring up the Ted Bundys and the John Wayne Gacy's, and they'll bring up the Al Capones and the John Gottis. And these are people that, even if they were at some point as a child offended against, they clearly led malignant lives and probably would have been beyond the pale of savior. If you're going to kill and rape a woman and stick something up her vagina, or if you're going to, do the St. Valentine's Day massacre and just kill people against the wall like Capone, what is the main rebuttal to people who would sort of ridicule the idea of forgiving the Capones and the Gottis and the Bundys and the terrorist types? Go ahead, Robert.
Well, I would say, first of all, let's not even talk about forgiving them, okay? Because that's just going to make people angry, and most people aren't ready to forgive these big things. I would say, let's look at forgiveness in a different way. Let's look at those who are the Al Capones now, walking around now, who have a story to tell, like my friend who shot up the whole family, okay? And let's focus on them, those who are walking around now with rage in their heart, about to kill a lot of people? How can we get to those people and see them as wounded human beings and give them a chance to heal from that, so they don't have to use a psychological term, displace their anger on so many people? That's what happens so often with the mass shootings these days. Let's face it, when you look at their psychological profile, many of them are young men, 19 to 21, and they've been bullied, bullied, and bullied. We need to find a way to heal their hearts rather than waiting until they shoot up the place and shoot up people, then throw them into jail. But even when that happens, those of us who might be accused of being bleeding heart liberals still have something that can actually protect society, which is helping to heal these people's hearts while they serve a justice term, so that if some of them get out, they will be quieter. Their hearts will be more healed, and they don't have to displace their anger onto others. The failure of the system is, again, reductionism, by focusing only on the behavior, punishing the behavior, and presuming once they get out, they'll be good boys and girls. How's that been going? Right? Statistically, not so great.
Erin, your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with Robert that a reason to think about alternatives to punishment and to try to develop models of responsibility taking and healing is something that's of benefit to all of us, to our society. I mean, we need to start thinking about, like, why are some of these problems occurring? What's the context in which people make the decisions that end up that land them in prison? Sometimes it's their anger. Sometimes it's aggression against them by law enforcement. Sometimes people are confused. Sometimes people are scared. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why people end up committing crimes or getting arrested and put into the criminal justice system. But we need to start looking at the context so we can start solving problems and people can get what they need in order to lead productive, law-abiding lives, which of course requires a larger social change. It's not just a matter of changing the psychology of particular individuals. I mean, these are issues of social justice. But I agree with the point that Robert has brought us back to a couple of times. Let's start thinking about the person as more than the crime that they've committed. And let's start thinking about people in the context of their lives and in terms of the experiences that they've been through and the hurt that they may have suffered. I think that the prison population is a population full of traumatized people. And Robert's right, no one's asking them, what happened to you? You know, what went wrong? What did you need? And if we don't start asking those questions, we're not going to move forward in a healthy way. I mean, these are really important changes to make for all of us.
So I was born in 1965, and I was born and grew up on the Brooklyn-Queens border in New York. And it was a very Goodfellas type, if you ever saw the movie Goodfellas with the Ray Liotta character as a youngster, he recently died, that kind of mafia kind of environment. And there was a lot of racial tensions from the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of violence, occasional flower power, but more negative than bad. I wanted to talk about two different approaches that were very popular in the 1970s in dealing with trying to get the idea of forgiveness. One was there was a famous documentary called Scared Straight, in which youngsters were brought to prisons to be talked to by lifers about not to follow in their footsteps, and it was thought that this was a good thing. Now, there's always been controversies about the film, how effective the program ever was. But another approach was something called the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, CETA. And that was where underprivileged kids who just had started getting into trouble, whether it was gang trouble or whether they had robbed a liquor store or something, were put into situations where they were employed by all sorts of things, whether it was craftsmen. My mom worked at a senior center. I used to volunteer there. I'd meet some of these kids. And it seemed to have been a very good program. It was cut when Ronald Reagan became president, and so I wanted to talk about those two kinds of things where, in the one hand, the approach is the scared straight approach to try to, keep kids out. And the other is let's try to teach these kids while they're still young and they haven't gone on to become a John Gotti or whatnot. Teach them skills, that life skills, and not just life skills, but you learn how to interact with people if you're working at a place. So let me ask you, Aaron, about those two kinds of approaches and the efficacy of either one.
I think they're both promising. I think education is tremendously important, offering people opportunities that give them alternatives to, life choices that will get them in trouble in the criminal justice system is really, really important. I think the bridge between the educational program and the Scared Straight program could be drawing on the resourcefulness of people who have been through the criminal justice system, have learned something about how to avoid that, have something to offer to young people that might be able to steer them in a healthy direction. But without resources that give people opportunities to get educated, go to college, finish high school, get a job, it's going to be hard to be convincing in some environments. So I think that these are very complex problems. I think programs that draw on the experience of people who have suffered in similar ways can be very helpful for people who are trying to change their own life situation.
Robert?
It seems to me that Scared Straight by itself is too narrow. It's what I call a consequentialist approach. And by that I mean, we try to get them to look at the consequences behind the behavior of crime and scare them to go straight. Well, again, if I'm one of those young men sitting there with those who are in prison and my heart is broken, I'm not going to care about the consequences. It could very well be I'm going to get to a point where I won't care. Right? So by itself, I'm not a fan. In conjunction with this broader approach that Aaron and I are talking about, I like it. With regard to education, again, it's a little bit too what I would call materialist based for me. Again, as you can see in terms of philosophical language, I'm more of a virtue ethicist. I talk about the heart, I talk about the interchange. And if we help people get jobs or get education, it's not enough. Let me just share a story with you that I think will clearly make my point. I once talked with the late Millard Fuller, who started Habitat for Humanity. He, of course, did the heroic issue of building homes for those who don't have them. And he said to me very simply, but very profoundly, we, meaning Habitat for Humanity, build the homes, you build the hearts. And unless we build the hearts, they can't stay in the homes. And he said one of the major criticisms of him in the early days was building the homes, bring people in for 6 months. Too often they trash the places and can't stay and become homeless again. Unless we build the hearts, they can't stay in the homes. So we have to add a dimension to Scared Straight. We have to add a dimension to jobs and education by transforming the person, the interiority of that person, toward what I would call less toxic anger, a higher form of humanity, if you will, that we all can reach, but we never talk about it. And we talk about the homes, and we talk about education, and we talk about consequentialism. But when was the last time you saw a thoroughgoing discussion of changing the broken heart? I haven't seen it. And I used the word frustrated earlier. I'm frustrated about that.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
I'd like to think that at least a certain kind of education can help with what Robert is talking about. I've been teaching philosophy in a prison in the Boston area. And the men that are in my class are so eager for information that they are getting from their college classes that helps them to think about, who am I? How did I get here? What is this society like that I live in? Why is it this way? What are the possibilities for change? They're reading literature, history, philosophy, political science, and using it to reflect on their own lives and to broaden their perspective in ways that are really transformative. So I agree with what Robert's saying, but I'd like to think about what kinds of education can help people to grow in the ways that he's urging, that we think about people needing to grow. And that's all of us. That's all of us. It's not just people that end up in prison. You know, how can we think and reflect about ourselves in an, ethically transformative way so we can start solving some of these social problems together?
So let me just ask. It seems to me, just as a layman looking at this, that one of the problems is that it's hard to convey to the mass public the benefits of forgiveness, both in and out of any kind of criminal justice system. Would a more materialist approach help in this sense, explaining that how society itself benefits from not incarcerating so many people, not farming things out to things like, and I think Joe Biden recently came out against the for-profit prisons, and also to actually, as I said, with programs like this CETA program years ago, that the society needs to widen the scope of its material bounty to include all, and that could. These are things that can get into everything from global warming to retributive justice or not. But it seems to me that one of the failures is that most people don't really realize the benefits of not, the old if the nail sticks up, hammer it down. If it's out, that. So let me just throw that out. Go ahead, Erin. You look like you're ready.
Sure. I mean, I think that skeptics about restorative justice and forgiveness are often coming at it, and I think you mentioned this from a skeptical point of view that somehow this is just being soft on criminals. But restorative justice and practices of forgiveness are really focused, many of them, in an important way on victims, on the suffering of victims, what it takes to heal from victimization. And what people need. So I think if we could think a little bit more about the benefits of forgiveness for those who have suffered crime, and many of the people that commit crime have also been victims of crime. So we're not even talking about two opposed groups here, but there's a lot of suffering out there, and so how do we talk about it in a way that enables people to heal from it? I think that that's really the focus of restorative justice and forgiveness, and maybe talking a little bit more about what forgiveness is and how it might achieve that could be helpful in this context. I'm sure Robert has a lot to say about that.
Well, I like very much Dan's idea that if we show people the consequences of this new model, in other words, less crime once people are out, safety where you can walk the streets without having your cell phone nearby ready to call 911. That's wonderful. But then we don't want to focus only on the consequences, but the means to achieve that. And I think Erin has articulated that wonderfully well. I really admire your philosophical teaching in a correctional context. Thank you for that. I think it's brilliant to do that and see these people who've been hurt and now are incarcerated growing in their humanity. I think it's wonderful. And so I agree also with this idea of focusing on victims who've been brutalized. And again, forgiveness, as I had said earlier, is very controversial. Why add another burden to them? And you might be just simply whitewashing what happened, and actually helping those who have been doing the victimization to forgive those who've hurt them. But as Erin is saying, we have to understand what forgiveness is. So if I could just take a moment, because I've been studying this topic for 37 years. I blinked and 37 years went by. And here's what I think forgiveness is. First of all, it's a moral virtue, as is justice, patience, kindness, love. All moral virtues deal with goodness toward others. Forgiveness specifically, its specific difference with all the other moral virtues, is its goodness toward those who are not good to you. And that's what makes it controversial. Why would I be good to that person? Why don't I just lock them up and throw away the key? It's goodness toward those who are not good to you, without making excuses, without forgetting what happened, lest it happen again, without necessarily reconciling with that person. You see, a victim within restorative justice might forgive and try to be good, not excuse, not forget, but not necessarily enter into a relationship with that person. Some have, and not throwing justice under the bus. So when you keep all of that in mind, it's also a free choice. It's not demanded in society as the moral virtue of justice is. If you don't stop at a red light, you're going to get a ticket. If you don't forgive, no one's going to punish you for that. That's what I like about it. So we have to understand what forgiveness is, and it's a personal choice, never, never, never demanded by anyone in society, or should be a never in a family or in any kind of a context, even when there's dialogue in a restorative justice context. No one should ever be pressured into doing this. It should come from the heart of the person when the person is ready, less fearful, having a chance to get over some of the trauma and the anger, and then ask the question, might this be healing for me? That's one of the major paradoxes of forgiving. When you are good to those who are not good to you, paradoxically, and we have scientific research backing this, you as the forgiver experience remarkable healing from anger, anxiety, depression, increased self-esteem, hopefulness toward the future, empathy toward others, and finding new purpose and meaning in your life. And again, because the science is new, people don't understand that. They don't see the paradox of forgiving, that when a person willingly chooses to do this and doesn't excuse, forget, necessarily reconcile, or abandon justice, astonishing healing can take place within this victim's heart. So it's not all for the one who is being forgiven, although that's what the essence of the virtue is. You are giving goodness to the other, but then you experience the healing. And that's where the transformation in society can occur. Even those who are behind bars now, seething with the hatred nobody sees.
Well, a lot of people would say, there are people I know who think just lock everyone up who commits some kind of heinous crime, forget parole or whatnot. But they have this idea that, we're going to let all the pedophiles out and they're going to apply to be grade school teachers,
Right.
So how do you, and again, that's the kind of thing that's foisted out there by mass media, whether it's online or in films, Hollywood films, or television shows, debating back and forth on cable news or whatnot. How do you get beyond those kinds of effective but very limited talking points?
I think we first of all have to go to Socrates, who used to always say, I am ignorant. And those who start professing a knowledge of forgiveness but don't, first need a humility, that's another virtue, where they say, I'm talking about this, but I don't understand it very well. Those who say, Aaron and Robert are dangerous to society because we're going to unlock all the doors, what have they done? They've missed one of the big fours of what forgiveness is not. What are the big fours? You're not excusing, forgetting, necessarily reconciling, or throwing justice under the bus. They're missing that final point. They're saying, well, if we start having forgiveness themes in prison, we're going to open the jail cell door. What happened to the theme of letting forgiveness and justice grow up together? The people who say that are missing that philosophical point and therefore degenerating forgiveness and therefore not giving it a chance. I consider that a tragedy born out of what Socrates would call, in his own humility, ignorance.
Erin, do you have a comment?
Yes, I think what Robert's talking about is very interesting. I think the reaction that what he's saying is to open up the, the prison doors is very far away from what he's talking about. He's attempting to define forgiveness as a process that a person can go through in reckoning with some wrong that was done to them that may be transformative for them in a beneficial way. I'm hesitant to describe forgiveness as a moral virtue because I think that that suggests that it's something that people ought to do. I prefer to think about forgiveness as a psychological change that people can undergo deliberately, and it's interesting to ask how, that may be beneficial to them and is beneficial to some people. I agree that forgiveness should not be mandated, and even calling it a virtue suggests that somehow a person that doesn't forgive is not virtuous, and I would hesitate to say that. I think that one interesting question about forgiveness, if we think about it as a kind of shift in one's attitude toward one's own suffering and anger, and in one's attitudes toward the person who caused the suffering and or anger, is how is it that we can decide to change our own attitudes? These attitudes may feel very consuming. When a person feels angry, it's not just or hurt, or upset or resentful. It's not like you can just decide to turn that feeling off. So when we're talking about forgiveness as something that a person can choose to do, the interesting question is how? How can I choose to change myself in such a profound way? What is that process like? Right? How is it something that I can undergo voluntarily when it seems like the feelings we have are not voluntarily chosen and can't be easily relinquished?
So let me turn then. I talked about earlier, we'll talk about race, sex, and forgiveness in the justice system. One of the things that certainly America suffers from is the criminal justice system is clearly biased against certain individuals. If you're not white, if you're not male, if you're not of a certain wealth status or fame status, your chances of getting a fair shake in the criminal justice system is obviously not as good as if you are have those qualities I described. Things like the Innocence Project come to mind that was constantly finding people, especially black males, in this system and some Hispanics, but poor people in general, getting shafted, whether it's on false claims of rape or murder or whatever it might be. What when we're dealing with the idea of forgiveness, how big of a stumbling block are things like race or sex or sexuality or a minority status to getting forgiveness? Because you always hear, for example, a white kid comes and shoots someone up. Oh, he was a disturbed boy. He needed to be helped more. Black kid does the same thing, 5 states away. He's an animal. He's a monster. He should be locked away for the rest of his life. Robert, let me ask you about the difference of how race plays into perceptions of the people and whether they can be forgiven or not.
Well, one of the things where those who are minoritized college students have been my teacher is in the idea of forgiving the system. I teach a course to those who are first generation in college, and a lot of them are not minoritized youth from these different racial backgrounds. And oftentimes in this course on the psychology of forgiveness, they have said to me, well, bad things happen person to person, but there's an overlay of a system that is very challenging to us. What is your view, Professor, on that? And I would usually say, and I think I was wrong on this, so we'll try to pick out concretely the individuals who have hurt you, like maybe someone who's pulled you over for a speeding ticket and was overly rough with you, and forgive concretely with specific people. But they kept coming back to me, and I've taught this course for over 12 years, and they say, but there's more to it than that. For example, slavery is an example. That was instituted by people we'll never meet because that was hundreds of years ago, and those people are deceased. What do I do about that, they ask me. And I have come to realize from their pressing the point that there also is, if they are ready, if they wish to do so, their choice, to also forgive the system, to forgive groups. And a brilliant philosopher in Canada, Trudy Govier, Govier, has written a book on forgiveness where she makes the very strong case that you can forgive not concrete individuals only who have hurt you, but entire systems that have perpetrated norms that are against you. I have come to realize that that is in fact the case. And so I have changed my thinking that you can forgive not just specific people who've hurt you in concrete ways, but those who are part of the norms of society that are disadvantageous to some people. You can still fight for change. In fact, I would make the claim as a psychologist that learning to forgive the system helps you with greater energy to fight another day for a fairer system. But you know, every time I say that, it's very controversial and people yell at me. I have given a talk on forgiveness in this kind of community context 14 times in the Middle East, okay? And it's at the invitation of others. I don't just go there. How many times do you think I've been yelled at in my talks in the Middle East? 14 times? I've been yelled at 14 times. And people basically say to me, get out of here. If I'm in the Palestinian community, they'll say, you're a shill for Israel. You just want me to lay down and die and accept their political nonsense. No, no, no. I'm saying forgiving the groups that might be perpetrating issues that are making it hard for you to live, to forgive and then be able to seek justice, perhaps in a new way and with renewed energy. So it's a highly controversial issue that you're raising here. And I have found with the students with whom I teach, it's a course on forgiveness, oftentimes they're open to this, but there's that, again, that overlay, that patina, if you will, of this is getting me to cave into the politics of the powerful, which is not the case. And I think forgiveness on this more abstract level of those who've perpetrated norms over hundreds of years can be healthy for individuals, families, and communities, but it's woefully misunderstood.
Want to go?
Yeah, sure. I think there is some tension between the ethics of one-to-one forgiveness, apology and forgiveness, and if it happens, reconciliation, and on the one hand, and an acknowledgement that many of the social problems that we're facing in the society are the result of collective wrongdoing, of institutional problems that affect groups of people. So it's important that if forgiveness has a role in politically changing society, that it not foster complacency. That's very important, because as we acknowledge, collective forms of wrongdoing, what we need is political action and organization. Now, there are activists like Martin Luther King who talked about forgiveness and love as part of a way of motivating people and strategizing to bring about social change. It was connected with the importance of having a sense of hope about the future, and with the importance of fostering peaceful change and a peaceful society. So I think there are important connections there, but it is complicated and it is controversial, and it's important to be careful to talk about forgiveness in a way that is compatible with politicizing people, galvanizing political action, and doesn't foster, as I said, complacency or a sense that one's supposed to have positive feelings toward people who have wronged you. So I think all this is just so interesting and worth talking about. But as Robert said, it's controversial and it's complicated to get it right. And there are all kinds of avenues for possible misunderstanding.
As you and Robert were talking, I was just looking something up because something Robert had said dinged my mind, and I want to here just talk about America specifically. I know Robert had mentioned the Middle East, but and I want to talk about America in the past and America in a relatively closer to the future and a personal aspect from my point of view. I was looking up Frederick Douglass because I remember something in one of his books years ago as a kid, probably in the 70s or early 80s in high school when I read it, when he talked about forgiving those who had enslaved him, and he I don't think he used the term forgiveness, but however he framed it, I was trying to find the quote, I couldn't find it, but his approach to dealing with it was that he was in the power of position now because he could see the larger picture that centuries hence that no one remembers who the people who sold him into slavery were. No one remembers the people who brutalized him in slavery, but he's remembered because he brings that extra dimension of a larger human scope to the moment that has now passed, thankfully, although similar things do exist today, whether you're on a Native American reservation, whether you're a Latino picking grapes in California, or whether you're living in poverty as a poor white in Appalachia or a black person anywhere in this country. To what degree does forgiveness by those who have been harmed, like Douglas was harmed by the system, how does that empower that person, and how does that power, how can that be channeled into something productive for other people in enlightening them about why forgiveness might be a good way to go? Let me start with you, Erin.
I don't know what Douglas said about forgiveness. I think he was a great leader, and he spoke very openly and honestly about the brutalities of slavery and how he survived it and the importance of fighting against it. And he was a great example. But I can't speak to his thinking about forgiveness. I do think that people who've been deeply wronged and hurt by the system, by institution, not only by one person, but by many people coordinating their wrongdoing together, can be psychologically, really hurt in ways that make it hard to act, to fight back. So I think that I guess what I'm thinking about is some research that I've been doing recently with a colleague at Tufts on practices of truth and reconciliation in Rwanda. And we interviewed some people who were survivors of the genocide. And one interesting thing that they said was that they needed to think about forgiving in order to feel like they had a future, like it was going to be hard for them to perform their role in the community, to parent their kids, to live in a way that was involved with the community rather than withdrawing from it, unless they found some way to relinquish some of the anger and hurt that they felt and that they had suffered because of this tremendous trauma. And the concept of forgiveness was helpful to them as part of the process of doing that. So as they described it, it was almost like the need to get some relief from the burden of the grief and the trauma that they had felt, so that they could then be engaged in society and work together with others to make their communities better. So I think it can have that role for some people, and it's important to think about it in that community and social change context for the usefulness of forgiveness as a tool to bring about positive social change and to heal the past.
Robert?
I agree with that. And another issue from Africa, we have to remember Desmond Tutu has a book called Without Forgiveness, There Is No Future. And he, of course, suffered under apartheid. And here's another very powerful idea about the oppressed that I just learned recently. And it came from a former heavyweight boxing champion, Mike Tyson, who was my teacher this past week when I saw a 30-second film about him discussing with a young African-American man who was very skeptical about forgiving. And Mike Tyson, the heavyweight boxing champion, said this to him: "The one who hurt you is not your enemy. He is now your master, because he has changed you. And he now controls your emotions." And you could see on the film the young man who was very skeptical said, "Oh, like this, oh," and his body language was like moving backwards a foot. And that was so powerful, I will not forget it. He is not your enemy. He is your master. He has changed you. He is in control of your emotions. When we forgive and choose to do so, those who have been oppressing are no longer the masters of those who were oppressed. And they still might be oppressed, but they ought to work against that. But now their own resentment, what's in their heart, as Mike Tyson is saying, will not destroy them.
I had mentioned bringing to the not as distant past, and I want to give two anecdotes from my own childhood about forgiveness and not forgiveness in concerning people that I knew. The first one is when I was about 7 years old. There was this older sister of one of my friends who's about 3 years older, and I won't go into all the details. But at one Sunday, summer afternoon, she had molested me. She had got me pinned in between two houses in New York. You have these row houses, and pinned between two houses. And she molested me, and she did it a second time later on. And I remember thinking to myself, even then, there's something wrong with her. And I didn't, even though I felt bad, I was, I guess, tuned in enough to know there was something wrong with her, because a 10-year-old girl, which she would have been, to have done that means something must have happened to her, that her father or a priest or an uncle might have done something to her. And I never really, I didn't look at that she was attacking me personally. There have been times at jobs or other things where people have come after me personally. To me, I was just there, and she was in some way expressing something of her own dissatisfaction or hatred of life, and trying to bring that to me, maybe to bring some sort of communion. A few years ago, I'm looking her up, and she died when about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was quite sad, because I always wondered whatever happened to her. And I take it she probably didn't have the best life. The second one is when I was in high school, there were these two brothers who were a couple of psychopaths. And there was this girl who went to high school with me who was mentally retarded. And one summer afternoon, again, I was walking down an alley. Like I said, this is a very Goodfellas kind of thing. And these two brothers were trying to rape this retarded girl. And I was right next to a rose bush. I pulled off as quietly as I could a big rose twig, and I rushed at the one smaller brother, and I raked his face with the thorns of the rose bush. That caused a commotion. The brothers ran away, and the retarded girl was not raped. But a day or two later, she was out with those brothers in the same area, as if nothing had happened. And I wondered to myself, I was like, how could she do that? Now, maybe it's because she didn't realize what was going to happen. I mean, she felt hurt and was crying when they were pinning her down to the ground. This would-be rapist, the younger one, also died a few years ago. And when I found out that he was dead, there was the usual homilies about, oh, he I guess became a born-again Christian or whatnot, and he was a family man and whatnot. But in my mind, he was always this wannabe rapist. And I didn't have the gut punch that I did with the girl who molested me. And I've always tried to wonder why that is. Is it because the retarded girl didn't have the facility to recognize what was happening to her? And so I'm just wondering, how do you get, I'm a single person, and there are I could forgive the one girl, but I still had negative feelings about this person who wasn't harming me, but that I had prevented from harming. I guess I'm just throwing that out there to try to get to the complexity of forgiveness and why some people can forgive one thing but not another. Let me ask you, Robert, what do you find these kinds of conundra within individuals, as I have with forgiving and not forgiving?
All the time. In fact, I have a book called The Forgiving Life, in which I ask people to create what's called the forgiveness landscape. And what they do in that is they make a list of all the people they can remember who've harmed them, and then they rate the pain on a 1 to 10 scale. And they start with the person who has hurt the person, where there is harm, but lighter, and go through the forgiveness process that we have as a psychologist, and then move up the ladder till you hit the big one, the one who's hurt you greatly. And it does take time to get to the one who's hurt you greatly. In other words, we do respond differently, and it's not clear psychologically why that is the case, actually, Dan. We're not entirely sure why you might give a 5 to one person who's hurt you and a 10 to another. And in this case, Trudy Govier, I mentioned her earlier, would call that secondary forgiveness. You've forgiven the guy who you put the rose bush to because he
No, I
didn't.
didn't. I didn't forgive him.
Yeah, right, right. But you could forgive him if you wish, and it would be secondary rather than primary because he didn't hurt you directly. Okay, so you're actually musing about the idea of, should I have, should I not have? He did hurt you, okay, but you've decided not to necessarily forgive him because what he did was so bad. It would have been very big on your landscape. Okay. With regard to the one who molested you at 7, I'm talking now as a licensed psychologist, you showed remarkable forgiveness maturity to see the possibility of her context in life, because that's part of our forgiveness process. Again, not to excuse, but to see the fallibility, the woundedness, the weakness, the pains of the other person, so that you begin to see the humanity of that other person, which can soften the heart from the rage, where you can begin approaching that person as a possibility. And so the other one just seems like it was much too much for you because the victim was so vulnerable in terms of her cognitive abilities. She couldn't even necessarily see it was right or wrong, as you said, because she was there with them the next day. So she wasn't processing it the way you think would be reasonable, which would probably make you even angrier at these guys because they were taking full advantage of another human being. You were seeing the humanity in her, and they were not, okay? And so on your landscape, you would have probably, in terms of your disgust with this, would have been very high. But had you gone through the landscape, maybe if you so chose, you still could, Dan, you still could forgive this guy, even though he's deceased. We can forgive the deceased. You could in your heart do that because you are carrying a certain disgust for this person. If you wanted to cleanse your heart from that, you could go for it, but only if you choose to do so.
How about you, Aaron? This ability or inability that everyone has, that they could forgive maybe something or not another thing, and how do we reconcile that and try to put it on all one spectrum if we can?
Yeah, first let me say I'm just really sorry that happened to you, and I agree that you showed a lot of resourcefulness. I think that the way in which you were able to process it as a child probably helped you not to be, more harmed by what she did, although I'm sure it was harmful in lasting ways. But it was resourceful to be able to gain that kind of perspective on it. It was self-protective, I imagine, to be able to take that perspective. With regard to the rape of the intellectually disabled child that you came across, I mean, it's not surprising to me that you don't feel inclined toward forgiveness in that scenario, because your relationship to that event was as a potential protector and somebody who could intervene to help somebody who was very vulnerable. And you did do that. And it was important that your perspective on the situation was realizing that this was a vulnerable person who needed protection, and there was something you could do. So, so your role there was to intervene in a way that was defensive of her, and that's also your memory of the situation, and it makes a lot of sense. Maybe it's not important for you to forgive in that scenario. The good that you did, and the way in which you took action and came to her aid is the most important thing, I think. And I don't think every scenario in which people are hurt demand forgiveness. We have to ask sort of what the person who's seeking forgiveness stands to gain from it. When and why is it important?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was just wondering, because like I said, I could put myself outside of someone hurting me and see a larger context, and the girl probably didn't have the mental facility to put herself in the crosshairs. So it was never that type of situation for her. And I'm wondering, is the ability to step outside of yourself and your own purview something that is, you know, a systemic part of forgiveness within an individual, do you think, Erin?
Yes, I think empathy for others is a central component in the possibility of forgiveness. That one of the things that a person who is trying to forgive does is to frame the situation in a way that they try to see what happened from the perspective not just of their own hurt, but of the experience of the person who injured them, and to think about the wider context and the role of other people in the history of experiences that led up to, the unfortunate wrong that happened. So I think that the kind of the exchanging perspectives that's made possible through the exercise of empathy is an important ingredient in the possibility for forgiveness, and helps us to understand how somebody could change their own thinking and attitudes through a process that involves the exercise of taking up other people's points of view, something that you did naturally as a child, and that sometimes we're discouraged from doing, unfortunately, with the models of criminal justice that are familiar to us. So I do think empathy is a big part of forgiveness and helps us to understand what the process of forgiveness is like and how it involves an exercise in thinking.
Robert, let me ask you, is there anyone beyond forgiveness? I mean, we'll throw out the typical kind of, the serial killer. I mentioned the Capone. Is an Adolf Hitler, a Joseph Stalin, a Mao Zedong, a Genghis Khan? When we talk about these numbers, there's Stalin had that famous saying, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Are there any people that you would say are beyond forgiveness, or is that an individual thing that every individual has to come to?
Yeah, the question asks if basically there's a universalism to a no regarding forgiveness. And the answer from a psychologist's viewpoint is there is no such person or situation. If you mention anyone, I can probably find a person I know who's already forgiven that person. Here's an example. Eva Moses Kor, K-O-R, was in Auschwitz, the concentration camp. And she and her sister, they were twins, Miriam and Eva, and they had experiments on them from Dr. Joseph Mengele. I put doctor in quotes, he's really not a doctor. And she actually forgave Dr. Mengele. And there's a film called Forgiving Dr. Mengele. Eva chose to forgive Dr. Mengele. Most in the concentration camp with her did not. In the film, you will see it is controversial. Those who are with her, one says it's improper. You don't do that. Correct. For the person who says it's improper, she is not ready. She is not ready to offer this. Eva Moses Kor was. And with regard to your earlier point with Erin, which I think is a really important point, you say we look at people in a larger context and we see the other person differently. And here's a major issue with regard to forgiveness therapy. I have done a lot of research on forgiveness therapy. In traditional psychotherapy, if you come to me with anxiety, I focus on you and when you feel anxious and what the context is. With forgiveness therapy, if you're my client, I deliberately shine the light away from you toward the person who has hurt you. And the focus of forgiveness therapy is not on the client. It's on the client focusing on the one who hurt that client, as Eva Moses Kor did. And so she was able to offer not just empathy, but also compassion, okay? And even what I would call a gift giving, where she is even seen going back to Auschwitz with another doctor, and they're walking arm in arm. And it's that gift giving by not focusing on Eva's own pain, but her focusing on the doctors. And here's why I would call this a moral virtue. It's not just empathy, it's compassion or suffering along with those who've been mean. And the gift giving, whether it's kindness or a positive word, or even trying to rehabilitate the other, which there are case studies on that. And it's that which can be transforming in the mind and heart of the client in psychotherapy. And some choose to do that, some do not. And if they don't, we don't push that. But I've never seen a situation that, as you've described, where I can't find at least one person who says, I have forgiven.
Erin, let me just tweak that a bit and ask you a similar question. A lot of people would say, "Oh, it's all well and good to talk about forgiveness of this and that, but you know, if Erin, if you were raped, or your husband was killed, or your lover was killed, or someone murdered your child, then we'll see just how eager you're going to embrace forgiveness. You know, the worm will turn." What is your response to someone like that says, you know, forgiveness is great in the abstract, but in the real world?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate challenge. I think it would be very difficult to do. And it's, I don't want to preach about forgiveness. I think that it may be helpful for some people in some scenarios, but it depends on what they're going through and what they need. So so yes, I think it is a good challenge. I think it would be difficult, but I do think that some victims of violent crime, or people who have lost loved ones to violent crime, have found that they don't feel a resolution that they were hoped for when the perpetrator is criminally punished. It doesn't bring about the closure that they seek, and they may then look for another avenue, and this may direct them toward restorative justice or practices of forgiveness or some kind of truth and reconciliation process. So, people may arrive at a need for forgiveness when they aren't satisfied with the alternatives. Nobody wants to be in a situation where they need to forgive somebody, right? It means that you're dealing with a serious problem and some deep hurt. And none of us knows, in advance how we're going to be able to deal with that. But, we follow the example of some people who have suffered greatly and found that an alternative to a kind of retributive, punitive way of thinking is more helpful for their own healing, that we can try to learn from that. And to go back to your earlier question, I just wanted to remark on, your question about whether anyone's beyond forgiveness. I was thinking when you asked that, like, why is it important to answer that question? I don't know the answer to that question, but do I need an answer to that question? Do we have to think about the very worst scenarios and whether one can or ought to forgive in those scenarios? Where my mind goes is, what's really important is that we don't have policies that we're institutionalizing where we're throwing people away, right? Where we've decided that a certain group of people is beyond hope and we're going to discard them permanently. I think that that's where we should be, focusing our attention, not on, sort of a scenario of some particular case that's the worst you can think of, and then with the danger that would be used to leverage some kind of policy that then applies in a much broader way.
Well, it's been a very lively and stimulating discussion. I will link to both of your university pages and to erinkelly.com. But before we go, I do want to ask a final question and then give you both a chance to talk about anything I haven't touched upon yet, or we haven't touched upon. My question, and I'll start with you, Robert, and then Erin. My question would be, what is the future of forgiveness here in the world today, and anything we've missed? And when I think of forgiveness, a lot of people have talked about the future, with things like global warming and all the things pushing off to other generations. We're going to have need intergenerational forgiveness because, a lot of people in 100 years are going to be like, those people are so damn selfish back there. What is the future of forgiveness in your mind, Robert?
The future of forgiveness is we first have to start dialoguing about it. It is something that has not been given the attention it deserves. We have to understand what forgiveness is, under the context we like it, what are we offering and what we're not offering. And then what we need is to start schooling people in families and in education. We have forgiveness education curricula from pre-kindergarten, age 4, through the senior year in high school, age 18. And we work oftentimes in conflict zones, such as Northern Ireland, Taiwan, Israel, and other areas like this. And we help children without pressure to learn about forgiveness through picture books, for example, through films. So we're not putting pressure on them to forgive. We're putting the educational imperative on them, again, if they so choose, to understand what it is. They're free to reject it out of hand and say, I don't like it, it's not good for me. But unless they know what it is, how can they go about it? And so I think the future of forgiveness is to give it a chance that in terms of the entire history of humanity, it has never been given this chance. And we have given away these forgiveness education curricula in over 30 countries of the world. We just had published what they call a meta-analysis of 20 studies across the world, Europe, Middle East, Asia, and the Americas. And it's shown statistically that when students have a chance, about 12 weeks, 1 hour a week, it doesn't take much, through stories, they tend to be able to forgive those who've hurt them. It generalizes, you see. They tend to reduce their anger. And in some of these conflict zones, even 6-year-olds, believe it or not, come to us with levels of anger that are close to the clinical level. So that if a licensed psychologist looked at the average profile, 6-year-olds are already at the point where their anger can do harm to themselves or others. Forgiveness education brings that down. Then let people use this as they wish. Let's not engineer it. Maybe they want to go into correctional institutions and, let's say, have a course on philosophy that includes forgiveness if they want to do that. Or introduce it into their workplace, introduce it into their house of worship if they will, right? And keep educators giving a little bit of this. I have a blog at Psychology Today, a national magazine, and I wrote an essay called Forgiveness or Math, Which Would You Choose? And it was controversial. Some people said, oh, how dare you take away mathematics? So I'm not taking it away. I'm just asking people, if you had to choose in an alternative universe, which of these would you want people to know? And I chose forgiveness, because if you don't know how to balance your checkbook, it won't kill you. If you don't know how to forgive and the storms of life bash you so hard that the toxic resentment is eating you away, that can kill you. A lack of forgiveness when treated brutally can kill you. Not knowing math won't. So I would choose forgiveness. Most people, this is not even on the radar. We need forgiveness education. We need it yesterday. We need it more intensively. So when the storms of life hit these children when they're 35, 55, or 95, they will have within them a tool for handling that issue so they're not crushed by it. That's where I think we need to head in the future.
Erin, same question for you. If there's anything we've missed you want to talk about, and also what do you see that forgiveness is the way of the future for our society, globally or nationally?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. One is, what's inspiring and interesting about the restorative justice movement is what we might learn from letting people who are most intimately affected by violence and wrongdoing try to work out some kind of solution with one another to find some measure of redress or repair, and to grapple with the truth of what happened. I think that's a very powerful model for thinking about accountability, and responsibility, and it's very different from the criminal procedures that we're familiar with in the criminal justice system. So I think that that does have a future. I think there's a movement behind it. I think it's something that we can learn a lot from, and that we should pay attention to. On a larger scale, we're talking about forgiveness in the context of the country, the United States, that has a history of some really egregious wrongdoing on the part of the government and those in power in our country, going back to slavery and its legacy, and the brutal treatment of other groups as well, including Native Americans. So there's a lot of reckoning to do with the history of wrongdoing in this country that might help to pave the way for forgiveness if those who have benefited from or have glossed over and not paid attention to the significance of this history could do a little soul searching of their own, and be part of a national dialogue. It shouldn't be all on those who have been harmed to come up with a solution and try to find a peaceful way forward. It's also those who have, been responsible for either perpetrating or benefiting from some of these injustices that should be part of the conversation and should step up and take some responsibility. So I'd like to see our conversation about forgiveness, which I do think has a future, connected with larger topics like reparative justice and redress that might help us to think through the history of social injustice that is really at the core of the foundation of this country.
Yeah, me personally, I think that in school the ideas of forgiveness should be taught. Again, like you say, Aaron, no one should force it down someone's throat if they don't want to or they can't or whatnot. But at an institutional level, I think it benefits. Individuals may not be able to, but I think clearly this society and the way it treats crime in terms of, we could go into all sorts of things. We failed. I mean, the last half century or so, the last 40 years, 50 years since the war on drugs, to me it seems a total failure. But I want to thank both Robert and Erin. A very enlightening conversation, so thank you for your time.
Thank you.
It's been an honor to be with both of you.